Good morning. Hemshech Tzadik Dalet, page 140. 141. Okay. So beginning on page 139 in Tzadik Dalet, Hemshech Tzadik Dalet, if you want to follow the text, go to ayinbeis.com. You can have the PDFs of these pages, which are all parallel. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 2, pages 1157, 1158. The second Eifin, the second type of bittul, where one senses that you're not in existence on your own. Your entire existence is dependent on the source. And without the source, you wouldn't exist. So he's explaining how that we'll understand this the way it is in Avodah. And the Avodah is the contemplation by Nivroim that their sustenance and their existence is dependent on the Creator. And we've been elaborating, the Frierdiker Rebbe has been elaborating what exactly is this hisbonenus, this contemplation. And he broke it into two types of contemplation, one about Tzva Shamayim, one about Tzva Bereshis bara lekimis Hashamayim v'sa'aretz. So everything divides between heaven and earth, the sky and earth, the heavens and earth, and the Tzva Ha'aretz are the creations, the creatures on earth, and the Tzva Shamayim are the creatures in heaven, meaning the celestial bodies. And the two verses that apply to each one of them more specifically, more Rabu Masecha Havaya, how many, the multitude, how many, the volume, the sheer volume of Masecha Havaya, your creations, God. And that refers to the volume of the different species, and in each species, further subcategories, and each category, further subcategories, and each element, even one tree, each leaf is different than from the other leaf. All this indicates that everything is driven by the divine, Hakol Elokus, by a wisdom, Kulam B'chachma Sisa, wisdom of the divine, and Ashgacha Pratis. That God governs everything to the smallest detail. He calls the smallest and even weakest creation. Okay. The second contemplation is one that goes more deeper into relating to the divine force that brings, and that is the awesomeness of God. So the vastness and the greatness, ma Godlu Masecha Havaya, is referring to the Tzva Shamayim. Godlu is now the word used, and Godlu is Gödel, sheer size. So though there is volume in Tzva Shamayim, and there's also great, large creatures and large entities in Tzva Ha'aretz, but the primary thing in Tzva Ha'aretz is the volume. And in Tzva Shamayim, he actually said two things. But still the focus here is what's the chiddush of Tzva Shamayim is Gadlus. So this immenseness, this awesome vastness teaches us about God's expansive vastness as well, meaning that this is teaching us about, as he says, the depth of God's thoughts. And then he brought the pasuk Hashamayim Misapim Kvoid Keil, that heaven relates the story, tells us the story of the divine honor, like a stone, like the stone that is carried and used by a very strong person, tells us about his strength. So he went on to say that this Misaprim, also Tzva Ha'aretz, they both tell a story. And we're talking about now the difference between the story that the earthly creatures tell us, and as I said, I repeated, we go again, is a story more about that everything is godly, it's made by wisdom, with wisdom and Hashgacha Pratis, and the story that Shamayim tells, which we're going to learn more about now. Well, we've already learned, we'll soon talk about the example, that tells us more of a story that we can say is more quality than quantity. So quantity also tells us the story of Hashgacha Pratis, of the divine, etc. And as he calls it, he says it's a Yediyah Naila. It's a very high level of knowledge. It's not like it's not this, he doesn't dismiss it. Just to use the words he said here. Yediyah Gdela v'Rechava Belakus. It's an expansive and great understanding in the godliness, but nevertheless, because it's defined primarily through tangible and empirical elements that we see, in other words, that we can relate to with our eyes and with our experiences. That's what he adds now. It doesn't compare to what he calls a yediyah iyunis, an in-depth perception that is provided to us by the story and narrative that the Tzva Shamayim tell us. So now he's adding in the volume, he's not just about volume and many, and that God governs every detail. It also means that things that you can relate to, in a sense, there's more mystique. I don't want to say the word mystique, he doesn't really use that word, but there's more emek and there's more depth and more sublime elements to the knowledge and awareness that Tzva Shamayim provide. So it's carrying it a little now further out. Soon he'll use the words kamus and echus, quantity and quality. And he makes, to explain this, he gives the difference between chochmas ha-maisa v'ha-b'poil and chochmas ha-nefesh. So let's talk about that for a moment. So sum up what we learned yesterday. So there's different types of wisdom, different types of skills and intelligence that we have in this world. There's an intelligence that's connected to and a skill of a craftsman, which means something that is negated to maisa, how to build something, how to craft something. We talked also about the chachma of b'poil, which I thought perhaps means like bringing execution, that there's a wisdom in how to execute and how to implement. So though it's chachma, and it could be brilliant, but it's so-called barometer that measures it, what he called meifsim, muchshim, mamoshim, are all things that are very tangible. You see it in the product. A good producer produces a good product. When you see the product tells you that this producer has the wisdom and the intelligence and the skill to be able to build that. Then there's chochmas hanefesh. Chochmas hanefesh is understanding the psychology, the psyche, the spirit of, usually chochmas hanefesh is referred to human beings. Understanding what makes someone tick. Now here, it's also a chachma, but it's chachma is not about anything you can measure and touch. No one has ever seen the nefesh. We don't have any type of empirical tools with which to touch or see the nefesh. I was thinking about it after yesterday's class. In a way, if you think of physical medicine, so it's also complex. But nevertheless, in physical medicine, let's say a person has a pain, God forbid, somewhere, or a fracture or an injury. So a trained doctor, whatever field it is, whether it's a cardiologist or neurologist or endocrinologist or whatever it may be, what they do, they understand the inner anatomy and biology and so-called other forces that are at work inside of us, and then suggest an intervention, whether it's medication, whether it's therapy, whether it's surgery, or other methods to be able to and the way you measure it, the moifus, as he calls here, how do you know that it's working? The healing works. It's not theoretical. There too, I wouldn't know if that's called chochmas hamaisa, to be honest, because I don't think it's chochmas hamaisa. Even surgery, even a surgeon, I don't know if it's chochmas hamaisa, because you're not dealing with, let's say, carpentry, a piece of wood, or clay, or glass, or gold, and so on, like a goldsmith. But nevertheless, is it like psychology? Like, for example, a soul doctor, a mashpia, someone who's a chochmas hanefesh, who understands the nefesh, they're far harder to measure. So even though he makes it clear, there are things you could measure. Listen, you could see a person becomes healthier, better marriage, happier person, more confident, more secure. So it's not like it's completely abstract. But nevertheless, as he says, the main focus in Chochmas HaNefesh are things that are much more sublime, remain what he says, fundamentally more ethereal and ruchni. So even the Chochmah that we could somewhat measure is also part of that ethereal element. It's more or less what he said. I'm putting it in my own words, but that's the Teichen Advarim. So like he says, "V'chein hine b'chachmas hanefesh, av gam ba'inyonim she'im boim b'muchish b'dugmas meivsi hamishrush b'geshem." Even things that come that are more palpable and tangible, like, for example, the indicators, that verify things in b'mishrush b'geshem that you can touch physically, like in chachmas hamaisa. Nevertheless, he says, I just lost my place. Yeah. Hari makol mokim acher kol zeh nisharim beruchniyusim hanafshis. It still retains and remains essentially in its more ethereal state, which means less tangible. And it's very clear because you're dealing with the inner workings, the deeper elements that make something. Like I gave the example, even bringing Chochmas HaMaisa side by side with Chochmas HaNefesh. Even though he doesn't do that here, but just to drive the point home. A product of a craftsperson, whether it's an piece of art or embroidery or anything that you see, indicates on the chachma, the wisdom of the one who built it, but you don't know the psychology of that person. What makes that person tick, you're not going to necessarily know. Chochmas HaNefesh goes far more into the inner workings, which of course is going to be relevant when we talk about creation. The creation of existence, Tzva HaOretz, tell us about the wisdom of the Creator. And Tzva Shamayim are going to give us a little more insight into the depth of the personality of the Creator, so to speak. We'll get to that shortly. I just want to finish the summary of what we learned yesterday. Like Kochas HaNefesh, then he gave the example of Kochas HaNefesh, the faculties of the human faculties, even though they have tangible and physical application, but they always remain faculties. They don't remain, they're not organs and limbs, they're the faculties within. And he says that therefore, right? And you could also know some of the quality of these faculties, and yet nisharim beruchni yusam. And then he says the reason for this is because when things are more ethereal, their very exist, their geder, their parameter is, and the way you verify, the way you establish and demonstrate its effect is eine kfi inyan kamuse ki im kfi inyan echuse, is not according to its kamus, meaning it's not about the faculty, not so much about their volume, the quantity, but about their quality. And then I'll just read what we learned yesterday. The bottom of page 140 and going to 141. It says, after this distinction that he made between these types of chachmas, he says, we'll understand, b'metzias aruchni is guf v'kamei seichel. Sheyesh hefresh ben seichel v'chachmas ha'maisa l'seichel v'chachmas ha'nefesh. So even though both of them are their veracity, misamtim b'meifsim, which means both of them can be established, you can demonstrate. I was looking for that word yesterday, misamtim b'meifsim. They're affirmed, they're confirmed, they're verified. V'shneim hinei ha'meifsim hem muchshim, and both of them, they're muchshim, which means there's something you can hold on to, something you can touch. Aval im zeh chilukim be'efen ha'muchish. I'm just reading the top of 141 quickly. Nevertheless, they're different in the way you can tangibly relate to them. Chachmas hamaisa, the wisdom in action, or things that are product-based, production-based, action-based, there the proof will be you'll understand the mitzias, the existence of the thing that is being understood, then hamusik. And chachmas hanefesh, you're dealing with the muhus, the inner personality of whatever it is that you're understanding, the musik. And there he goes now. V'zehu shemitzvah shamayim asher mehem anu yedim mo godlu ma'aseh havaya. And this is when we say that now the tzvah shamayim, the heavenly or the celestial bodies, from which we know the godlu masecha, the greatness, not the ribui, not the many, but the, in a sense, the quality in their size and in their greatness. This perception, this awareness is because how very deep are your thoughts, God's thoughts. So going back to the initial words, this is a deeper perception of the Creator than the Yediyah Mukhshis, than the more tangible and more palpable one. And you say that the earth is filled with your possessions, which is what we know from the earthly creatures, the earthly bodies. Bedugmas dover ma, bedugmas dover k'may chachmas hanefesh legabe chachmas hamaisa. For the example, chachmas hanefesh compared to chachmas hamaisa. So in a sense, the tzvah shamayim give us more about the personality of God and the deeper personality. So like we said yesterday, and I'll repeat it, in a sense, the vastness of the heavenly celestial bodies and the sheer space and all of that teaches us somewhat about like the bligvul of Elokus and the quality of the divine and the volume and all its details and the breakdown of every species teaches us about how the divine providence and the chachma, like you said, kulam b'chachma sisa, the wisdom that is in this, in the craft, in the art, in creating such art, but less about the inner personality, so to speak, or what he calls here, the omkum achshavisecha, like chachmas hanefesh compared to chachmas hamaisa. So let's continue. We still need more explanation on this because obviously if you want to play devil's advocate, you can argue, one second, you cannot derive any depth of God's design from studying, let's say, a heart or a brain or other tangible earthly items. Is it only to say that God can make many things and he governs it all? There's no inner depth. Today we know there's depth on tzvah oretz that can be compared to tzvah shamayim. So what does he really mean that tzvah shamayim is godlu, more godlu than rabu? But let's leave that question till we finish the whole idea, because maybe there'll be things that the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to say that'll help us understand. But right now, that's the statement. One is more chachmas hanefesh, and one is more chachmas ha-maisa. Okay. Now he continues. V'zeu hashamayim mesaprim kavod keil. And this is going back to where he began this subject. The heavens relate. They tell the sapim, they tell the story, they tell the narrative of kavod keil, the honor of God, the glory of God. The tzvah oretz v'tzvah shamayim shnei mesaprim kavod keil. He repeats what he said earlier in the previous page. Both of them tell the story of God's honor, not just heaven, also oretz, tzvah oretz. Elashem chalukim be'inyan ve'efen sipuram. But they're different in the inyan, in the content and the manner by which they tell us the story of God's honor. The tzvah oretz mesaprim u'megalim demola oretz kinyanecha. The earthly creatures narrate or tell us and reveal for us that the world is filled with kinyanecha, your possessions, your acquisitions, it's yours, meaning God's kinyan, God's creations. Shakolu alakus, that everything is godly, because everything is governed, first of all, created, energized, and governed by godliness. So everything is your kinyanecha. That's what that contemplation leads you to. Shakolu alakus. He said that expression a few times already in the previous page. That's what the contemplation leads you. V'tzvah shamayim, and the celestial bodies, the heavenly bodies, Misaprim and Megalim, they tell us, and Megalim, and reveal for us, that your thoughts are very profound, are very deep. The Lakus hu akel. Here he reverses it. Lakus hu akel. That godliness is everything. So, what's the difference between saying everything is godliness and godliness is everything? So, there's actually it's an expression that the Frierdiker Rebbe, I believe, I don't know if it originates from the Frierdiker Rebbe, but he definitely talks about it in Likutei Diburim and a few other places, where he says, Alts is Gott, Gott is Alts. So there's actually an interesting letter from the Rebbe who explains the difference between the two. I didn't have a chance to look it up, but if I recall correctly, what he says the difference is, it's where you begin. What is a reality that you are living with? When you say everything is God, everything is your reality. And you work your way, almost like Das Tachten. You work your way up and say, everything I see, initially, I thought it was just, let's say, a self-contained creation. And you come from everything, you come to realize, no, everything is governed, is created, sustained, and governed by godliness. Mala Aretz, the earth, is all your kinyonecha. And you come to it through the contemplations we've been discussing. You contemplate on the volume, on the species, on the perfection, on each detail. Earlier we said you contemplate on the fact that it perpetuates, the species continues. But it's earth and the earthly creatures that brought you to that awareness. When you say Elikus is hu hakoil, that godliness is everything, you're starting with godliness, and you're saying that godliness is not just removed from existence, godliness is really the essence of all of existence. So really what you're talking now is from the perspective of Elikus, and that Elikus encompasses everything. So it's really two different ways of going. Whether you begin, I exist, and then I come to the conclusion that my existence is determined and controlled, and really the godly desire and will and godly force that gives me existence, or you're talking about godliness, and godliness manifests himself in existence. So let's go back to the example with the art, Chachmas HaMaisa and Chachmas HaNefesh. If you see a piece of art, so the first thing you see, it's a beautiful piece of art. The art leads you to the conclusion that there's an artist, obviously the existence of an artist, but also he's a wonderful artist, a brilliant artist. There's a wisdom. Every detail of the art teaches you more about the artist. But your perspective is from art to artist. Now you know that the art is not an existence of its own. It's really all the artist expressing himself. When you go into Chachmas HaNefesh of the artist, in this case of the divine artist, you're starting, no, God doesn't need existence. I'm not even beginning with existence. There's something about godliness which chose to create art. You're far more focused on the artist. Like, why did you create this art? What's the purpose in it? You're not beginning with the art as a given, and that leads you to the artist. You're beginning with the artist and trying to figure out how the artist, from the inside out, created art. Like the story I mentioned when you talk about Elikus, it's not mamish the same, but just the difference between Elikus b'pshitis and Elam is b'yischachus, or Elam is b'pshitis and Elikus b'yischachus. So when you say Elam is b'pshitis, you're saying existence exists. There's no question. I wake up in the morning, I know I exist. But then I say Moida Ani, and I acknowledge and become aware, and with more contemplation and more Aveda, that there's a God. But it's b'yischachus. It's a novelty. It's not the natural first reaction. When you say Elikus b'pshitis, Elikus is a given. As much as we think we're a given, Elikus is a given, and from that perspective, so there's a world. Yes, there's a world because God wanted to create a world. So the novelty is existence. The story of the the chassid and non-chassid debating the existence of God, back and forth in all the arguments. And finally, the chassid says to the non-chassid, he says, exasperated, he says, I envy you because you think about God. You clearly think about God all the time. And to be honest, all I do is I think about myself. So, and with that, they parted ways. The non-chassid felt flattered that this great chassid and scholar and respected individual gave him such a compliment. But then in time, either someone illuminated him or he illuminated himself. In time, he comes to understand it was actually not a compliment. He thinks about himself all day because the chassid knows that God exists. It's elikus b'pshitis. He doesn't have to think about God. That's a given. The question is, the chiddush is him. So he wonders, do I exist? Don't I exist? Why do I exist? Am I an illusion? God is reality and I'm the so-called newcomer. By the other one, it was the opposite. He exists. That's a given. He doesn't have to think about himself. He's so much himself. He's so much reality, such a given, doesn't have to think about it. What does he think about God? Does God exist? Does God not exist? How God exists? Why God exists, etc. This isn't just semantics. So this, if I recall correctly, is how the letter explains it, to, maybe not so elaborately, but the basic gist. So what he's saying here is, interestingly, that even though you would think Tzva Shamayim is just is same thing like Tzva Aretz. They're both creatures and creations of God. One happens to be on earth, one happens to be in the sky. What's the difference between the sun and a tree? They're both creations of God. And yet, he's making it clear that number one, down below, volume and kamus. Volume is the key thing. And the details and the species and all the details that we can study and we can touch, it's tangible. I think that's what a very key point that he came to. In heaven, in the heavenly bodies, it's true they're also creations, but they play a different role and they tell a different story. First of all, they're beyond us. It's not something you can just go over and study a tree. Nobody can go into the sun and study the sun. Yes, we study it from a distance and with telescopes and its effects. Secondly, I don't know if this is the order. It's the sheer size, the awesome size of it. It reflects on something beyond, like we spoke about. And as such, it's much more sublime. So it's not just same creations, it teaches us much more about godliness, about godliness, whereas this teaches us from creation, like it could be the muchesh, the fact that you can touch and empirically experience it. So it teaches you about the God that put this product into place. In the heavenly elements, because of their mysterious element and because it's not that mukhshi, like he says, you're learning more about God, and that godliness is manifest into everything. So in a sense, heaven is more sublime. There's no question he's saying it's more ruchniistic than earth. It needs more explanation, but that's clearly what he said now. And now he added this, everything is God, or as God is L'kus Hu'akol, God is everything. This is my explanation up to this point. The topic isn't over, so I would reserve concluding a conclusive and definitive explanation until we finish learning it inside. But so far, I think we can safely take this approach and continue on now, unless somebody has a question. Okay, fine. Ubezeh Yuvan, I'm continuing now, the line Hu HaKel on page 141. And with this, we'll understand, and here the Rebbe says down below to look, the Mittler Rebbe Siddur on the Pasuk HaShamayim Esaprim and Pirush HaMishmilis, Madura Basra Perik Yud. These are two svarim from the Mittler Rebbe, which are both based on tefillah. Remember, HaShamayim Esaprim K'vayt Kel, we say in davening. So both of them have explanations, and the Rebbe is referring there because some of the ideas here are based on those Maimorim. So here's what the Rebbe says. Here's what the Frierdiker Rebbe says. Ubezeh Yuvan. Again, I want to just repeat, the Rebbe's footnotes were written, well, I'm not sure when the Rebbe wrote it, but most likely was written around the time, excuse me, Tafshin Yud Aleph. That's why this is Sefer Maimorim Tafshin Yud Aleph. Because the Rebbe continued giving out Kuntresim, single pamphlets at almost every Shabbos, or not every Shabbos, but for definitely every special date. He continued giving it out until 1952, till Tafshin Yud Beis. So that's why it's called Sefer Maimorim Tafshin Yud Aleph. But it was this Maimon is from Tzadik Daled. It's obviously not from Tafshin Yud Aleph. And the Rebbe added these footnotes, just in case you're curious. Okay, so he says,
add that in Tafshin Yud Aleph or before?
I just said Tafshin Yud Aleph. This came out. If you look at the beginning of the Maimer, you'll see a date. Rish Chedesh Kislev Tafshin Yud Aleph.
The Rebbe's Ha'aretz maybe were written in Tzadik Daled?
Absolutely not. For sure not. Because it came out in Kupir. There was no Ha'aretz then. Look at the introduction to the Maimon. I'm referring you. Look to the beginning. The Rebbe says, Rish Chedesh Kislev Tafshin Yud Aleph, and he says, I'm adding Ha'aretz. I've added Ha'aretz for this publication. It's connected to this, just like Basi Legani Tafshin Yud. That came out for Yud Shvat. The Rebbe added the footnotes then, not earlier. I don't know what day he did it, but the week probably before, or a few weeks before it was published. Okay. And with this we'll understand understand how it's explained, how the Zohar interprets this pasuk. And Zohar gives us the Maramakim, second volume, page 136b, Kuflam Daf Kuflam Advav Amid Beis. So what's the Pirush in the Zohar? On Hashamayim Misaprim. Misaprim, the Zohar says the Misaprim, the pasuk says Misaprim, they tell. My Misaprim. What do they tell us? What story do the Shamayim tell us? So the Zohar continues. Itema command mishtoi sipur dvarim. If you want to say that it's like someone who's telling you a story, like someone's telling a story. Lav hochi. It's not that way. In other words, you would think misaprim means like someone telling a story, but it's not the case. But Pashtus is because they don't actually tell a story. So what do they do? What does Shamayim exactly do to tell us the story? So he continues, Ela de naharin v'netzitzin b'netzitzu de nahura ilah. They radiate. Naharin means like oyer. In Aramaic, naharin. V'netzitzin is like sparks. They sparkle. B'netzitzu de nahura ilah, from the sparks of the higher supernal light. In other words, he's teaching Mesaprim from the word sapir, oyer. That they radiate, they shine. In the Siddur and the Pirush HaMilas, they explains it at length, but he's going to continue. We're not finished because you see two different types of light. Because he doesn't say Naharin would be just light. When you say V'netzitzin, you mean also sparks. So what's the difference? He's going to explain. So bottom line, the Zohar is saying, what story does it tell? You would think it's like just a story. He says, no. It's they radiate a light and sparks from a higher, they're basically revealing a higher dimension of Oyer. So here you right away see that Shamayim is revealing Oyer. It's not just telling a story about God, as we'll soon explain. So he continues. This is now the explanation in the Zohar. So he says, Naharin v'netzitzin hem beze fane er. These two expressions, where he says Naharin v'netzitzin, radiate or illuminate, and sparkle or spark, are two types of Oyer. Naharin hun er hameir. You say Naharin, you mean er, a light that shines. V'netzitzin er hamisnetzitz. It's a light that sparkles. Like when you see, for example, sparkling light is not a flowing light. A sunlight, for example, is a Naharin. It flows. But let's say when you strike a flintstone, which he's going to bring now shortly, it sparks. Sparks fly. Or you strike a metal. There are times where the light is more of a sparkling nature than of a flow of ongoing flow of light. Era misnetzis. So in Chassidus, there's a concept called Era misnetzis. Generally speaking, I don't know how much he's going to explain, but I'll say Generally speaking, when you are revealing a deeper light, often it's misnates. You know why? Because it's coming from such a deep place. It can't just flow in a regular flow. It could only come as sparks. So spark is like a davar nifrid. When you say, for example, a flame, you're shining a flame. So a flame is shining and illuminating. Sparks usually are a sign that they're coming either through distress, they're only sparkling, you could say it's weaker than the light, or you could also say it's higher than the regular light because it's coming from a deeper place that can only express itself like sparks, like little flashes, instead of a full flow. But let's see how he's going to explain it now and how it relates to Hashemayim Mesaprim. So he continues. The Asipur de Shemayim, the story of heaven, which means Hashemayim Mesaprim, the story that heaven tells, Heim bebeze fanim digili. They manifest in two ways of revelation. In other words, the Shemayim tells us two types of narratives, or they reveal two types of light. Ha'echad be'er ha'meir, one through Eir HaMeir, of a shining light, and another be'er ha'misneitzes. The Rebbe says in the bottom, it should say Hameir v'habeis be'er ha'misneitzes. That's missing the word v'habeis, the second. Okay, so in other words, the Shemayim is revealing and illuminating in two ways. One through a radiating, illuminating light, and one through a sparkling light. What does this mean? He says, V'nizbar le'il, it was explained earlier, he's referring to Perek Chav Zayin. If you remember chapter 27, if you recall, when he was speaking there, the difference between the seichel as it reaches into the koyach hamaskil and the seichel as it reaches into the koyach ha-seichel ha-atzmi, ha-yuli ha-atzmi. Same thing with rotzen. But with seichel, he gave the example of a coal and of a flintstone. And there he said, I'll tell you, it was on page, if you want to see it on the page number, chapter 27 would be page 120 on the top there, the whole page actually. So there he was coming to explain, there the whole point was to explain how oir, like rotzen, even though it's infinitely distant from the etzem, but it reveals the etzem and also is more relatable to even the koyach yulia atzmi. While seichel is more dover nivdal, removed from the koyach hamaskil and definitely from the sparks, from the flintstone, meaning from the potential core seichel. That's what he said there. Now he's using it regarding our discussion, how Shemayim reveals, but it's connected because remember, this is all an example of the second type of bitlin oir, which is that it's not an existence of its own. So it relates. So he says, so we explained be'inyan hamoshel de gacheles surah chalomish. Why doesn't it say vit surah chalomish? Okay. In the example of the coal and the flintstone, gacheles surah chalomish. It seems to me it should say vit surah chalomish. Okay. And the Rebbe doesn't remark, so I guess he's just counting the category, the muscle of the coal and the flintstone without saying a vav. Okay, I don't think there's any big diuk here. What did we learn?
It should be a vav, lichora.
Yeah. Okay. What did we learn there? Teitzos ha'esh magacheles hu de'idei yigia da'hafacha. To draw out fire from a hot coal, that is, it's hot, but you don't see the flames. How do you do it? It's through the effort of blowing on it, fanning it, if you recall. You have to fan it. Hafach, from the word neficha, from the word like vayipach ba'apov, vayipach. Va'esh ha'yetze, hu eish ha'mispashet. Meir umislahiv. And the flame that emerges when you do that, when you fan a flame, a coal, what will happen? The flame doesn't start sparking. It's not sparks. the flame, you can see a flame that rises. You ever see when coals are really fanned, the flame is rising, and it gives, and like he said there, and he gives all the he describes it. It's Eisha Mispashet, it expands. Mispashet means it spreads out. Meir irradiates. Or Mislav, and it's like Mislav, it's a fiery. Mislav is like, and generally Mislav can be passionate, but here he means it's a fiery, burning fire, a very, like a flamey fire, like a torch. Well, it's a lahav. In other words, you have a real flame going on. He's used mispashet, meir, mislav. How about when you strike a tzur? What's he going to say now? A flintstone. Is different. When you're drawing out a spark or flame, fire, from a tzur, from a stone, meaning here the flintstone. Here, you have to strike it with intensity. You can't just fan it. You can't even strike it lightly. You have to strike it strongly. And now that's regarding the effort that has to be exerted. What about the result? So in contrast to the flame that comes out of the coal, and the flame that emerges from the flintstone through striking it, it's mavrik. Mavrik means like a lightning, like a bolt, lightning bolt. You say a barak mavrik. It's like a flash, like a spark. It doesn't come like a radiating flame. For example, on coals, you can make a barbecue. Even frankly, even if the coals are not flaming. But when you want to fan it, it's burning, it's going to make a thing. You can't make a barbecue on flintstones, even if you strike them, because it's sparking. Yes, the spark, you can light something with the spark. You can take the spark and put it, let's say, near a piece of, near a wick, a piece of cotton or something, and you can catch the fire. But on its own, it's like he says, it's bolting and sparkling. So there you have a different type of oir. Of course, he's comparing this to the two expressions in Zoyar Amisaprim. Narin u'netzitzin. Narin v'netzitzin. So he says like this, okay. Asher hadugma mizeh ba'askola v'yischakmus hu. Now, the dugma of this, why did he bring it back there in page 121, chapter 27? The dugma from this was ba'askola, in conceiving and in innovating seichel idea, hu b'shnei darka hizgalus ha-seichel. There are two methods, there are two ways of how seichel is revealed. A person, we have seichel in our mind. How do you draw that seichel out? There are two ways. One, like fanning a coal, and the other, like striking a stone. What are the two ways? B'derech eir yashar u'b'derech eir chezer. If you recall, that was the language. Derech eir yashar is you sit and concentrate and learn. Yes, exert yourself, and you understand the sugya and gemara or whatever it is you're learning. That's eir yashar. Derech eir chezer is like we learn through questions, through challenges, through arguments and counter arguments and concealments and so on. That's the eir chezer. That requires more exertion, and then requires even deeper exertion to answer the questions. So that draws out like the sparks from the flintstone. The first eifin is like is fanning it, so there is an effort, yigia de hafacha, like he said, and that draws out the regular flow of seichel from the koyach hamaskel. So he says, now here's the difference of where they draw the seichel from. These two methods, or these two paths, these two ways of drawing out intelligence, seichel, intellect, one eir yashar, eir chezer, like the coal or like the flintstone, he says there's two ways from different sources, from the different sources of where intelligence and intellect originates from. Koyach ha-seichel ha-yulia atzmi, hanatur mushush be'etzma nefesh, that's the deeper one. That the power of intelligence The Hayuli, the potential and core intelligence that is Natua, is implanted, umushrish, and enrooted, the etzem nefesh, in the core of the soul. It's not even considered a mocker for seichel. It's basically in the soul, the power to conceive of ideas. And the second level, meaning the second way, where does it reach? And that's through fanning, through the lesser effort, but still effort. The second level, if you remember, there were the three levels: atzmi, keiches nalamim, keiches gluyim. And what is that in seichel? He says that's the koyach hamaskel, the power to conceive. That's not koyach atzmi, hiuli atzmi. That's the power to conceive that is already something that is a gili hanefesh. It's not natua. It's not implanted within nefesh. It's already an expression of the soul, not seichel yet, but it's now the potential, the capacity, and that's specifically focused on seichel. Shababam shochin alemes, that comes in a concealed type of transmission. We learned about a concealed transmission and a revealed one, meaning it's ready to emerge, liyes mokel seichel gali, but to become a source for the revealed level of intellect. So the three levels, and so there are two ways. Okay, that's what we learned earlier. Now he's going to apply this concept to Hashemayim Mesaprim, to the two types of oyer that he said, that the narrative that the heavens tell us. Derech Eir and Derech Eir Yasher and Derech Eir Chezer, both are related to us. The Naharin, as he said, V'netzitzin. Eir and Nitzutz, meaning a flame and sparks. V'zehu, Hashemayim Mesaprim. And this is what the heavens tell us, or reveal to us. The Mesaprim ein hakavana command the mishtoy sipur dvarim. That's the language in the Zohar. Mesaprim is not the intention like one who's busy, Mishtoy is busy in telling story. Shehu hayidiyah hamuchshis the malaris kinyanecha. Friedrich Rebbe is saying the shlila, what the Zohar negates, is saying that's not what heaven does. That's what earth does. The creatures on earth that tell us that the entire world is filled with your possessions, that's a story. Because it's a yediyah muchshis. It's a perception that's a tangible, palpable perception. So that's like a story. What about Hashemayim Mesaprim in heaven? Elo is not that. It's the Naharin u'menetzitzin ba'beze fani v'darke haskola der yasher ve'echezer. It radiates and sparkles in the two ways and approaches of conceiving of Eir Yasher, direct light, and Eir Chezer, refractive light. Okay, but he didn't explain what this means. What's the difference? What are these two ways? What is Shemayim telling us? So now he's going to continue to explain. You see the very slow development of this idea, but I say slow because my understanding, because since he said it was a Hizbananus, the whole thing began, this is all Aveda, contemplation. So the Friedrich Rebbe is laying out the full story, the full contemplation, step by step by step. So to sum up what we've learned so far is that the contemplation is two ways: morabu masach havaya, mo godlu masach havaya, tzva haaretz, tzva shamayim. The difference between the way they tell the story, and one is that is telling us everything is godly. Hakolu alakus, shgacha pratis, mala aretz kinyanecha. It relates to something mukhshi, something you can tangibly see, experience, relate to. You can actually dissect it. You know, we see all these plants and all the stones that he described earlier, all the species. In heaven, it's less tangible. Tzva shamayim. There, the focus is godlu masecha, which relates more to the quality, and like he said, ma'id amku, the depth, chachmas hanefesh. And now he's explaining with this, we'll understand the Zohar, that shamayim radiates. Misaprim means it radiates in two forms of illumination, which she didn't explain yet. Whereas the Sfa'aretz tell a much more tangible story. I see the word mukhshis has become more prominent. In the beginning, it didn't focus on how palpable and tangible it is, even though maybe I'm wrong, maybe it did. I'm just looking back quickly. There he focused more on volume and size or even quality. Okay. No questions, we'll continue. So he says, Dehine Ksiv, he's now going to explain what this means, this two types of Mesaprim, the two types of the two illuminations that the heavens tell us. Dehine Ksiv, now it says, so the Rebbe says, now if you look below, now he zeichens to Sefer HaChir of the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rishimus of the Tzemach Tzedek on this pasuk, which is printed in the end of Sefer HaChir, Derech HaMunah, and also Hemshech Mayim Rabim. Just for footnotes, the Rebbe zeichens on this topic, because we discussed at length there. So it says now, it's introducing another pasuk here, famous pasuk, which is Sa'u Modem Einechem V'Re'u Mi Bara Eila Hameitzi B'Mispet Tzvam L'Kulam B'Shem Yikara Merev Einim V'Omitz Keach Ish Lei Nedar. Okay, so let's translate what this means. Su Modem Einechem, raise your eyes to heaven, to above, Modem. And see who's created all of this. So in other words, you look at the universe, you look at existence. It says, raise your eyes upward and see who's created. Mi bara ela. Hameitzi b'misper tzvam. The one who draws out, who meitzi, from him extends the misper, the volume, the number of Tzva'am here is referring to the stars, most likely, but probably all celestial bodies. Maybe Tzva'aretz too, to be honest. But he says Shamayim, Morim. Anyway, then he continues. I lost my place here. Oh. L'kulam b'shem yikara.
Yikra.
Yikra. They all call out. What does that mean? They all call out. They all indicate to the name and power of God.
He's calling everyone with a shame. Everyone is important to him. He is calling.
Okay, right. You're right. Each, in other words, he created all these tzavah, each one with their name. With a share, Merev Einim V'Amitz means with a share.
Merev Einim V'Amitz Koyach.
What?
Merev Einim V'Amitz Koyach.
You sure Koyach doesn't go Koyach Ish Neder? Oh, you're right, Ish Neder. Okay. Merev Einim V'Amitz Koyach, with great strength and power. Ish Neder. Not one of those individual creatures Leinedar is missing out. In other words, every single one is empowered by the Creator. No one is missing. So now he's going to explain. Obviously, it relates very much to what we're learning here, because you're talking about Hashemayim Mesaprim Kveitel. You're talking about how we contemplate by looking upward on the Creator, and how the Creator creates all the different elements, and each one with their unique personality, and not one with great power, and not one is missing. You'll soon see where that Koyach Leineder is going to talk about Kayomim Be'ish and Kayomim B'min. Here, Ish Leineder would be Kayomim Be'ish, that they perpetuate, each individual never ends, never dies, basically. So he says like this. The Su'u Morim Einechem Rosh Teva Shema. Su'u Morim Einechem, the first three letters of each, the first letter of each of these three words adds up to Shema. Su'u, Shin, Morim Einechem, Shema. Like Shema Yisrael. Shahu, K'moy Shema Yisrael. That's like you say, Shema Yisrael, Yisrael. Listen, he says now in Yiddish, Aid der Hert, da Havaya Lekenu. So Shema Yisrael, Hashem Lekenu, Hashem Echad, or Shema Yisrael, Havaya Lekenu, Havaya Echad, Aid der Hert, Yisrael der Hert. Shema means not just you listen, you listen deeply. Der Hert. And what are you, what's der Herter? What is he absorbing, or what is he internalizing? The Havaya Lekenu. That Havaya is Lekenu. That Havaya is our koyach. The koychenu Havaya. So we say Lekenu, you say in the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Gemara, Elikim is koyach v'chechelis. It's referring to God's power and our power. So our strength and our power comes from Havaya. Havaya is our koyach. That means Havaya Lekenu. That Havaya is our koyach. Koychenu Havaya. So that our strength comes from Havaya. Sheneshamis Yisrael, explaining now what Shema is, which will take us back to Su'u Morim Einechem. Sheneshamis Yisrael helemayla min ha'teva. Souls of Israel are transcend nature. V'anhogi itam u'bederech lemayla min ha'teva. And the way God governs the behavior with them, their attitude to them, the anhogi. The attitude toward them from heaven is b'derech l'mayla min ha'teva, is also transcending nature. In other words, the koychenu havaya means that our koyach is not coming from Elikim. Elikim is hateva. If you said that the koyach of the Jewish people comes from Elikim alone, that would be through his slapshus b'derech hateva. When you say havaya lekenu, you're saying that havaya, which is l'mayla b'derech hateva, that's our koyach. That's who we are. That we're connected to and driven by a koyach. The koyach is not from hateva, but from havaya lekenu. Then he continues. That's a good. Shema Yisrael Hashem lekenu, and then what? The last two words, Hashem echad. What is that saying? Achdus habeida baruch hu. That's referring to the unity of the Creator. B'chol hanevroim, how He's unified within all of creation. Hainu, which means the kol hanevroim moirim ala achdus. In other words, you could say, God forbid, that God is one, but the creation is a multitude. It's not one. And Hashem, achdus Hashem, is only by God in God's domain, but not in existence. So it says, no, Hashem Echad, that is Achdus, is Bechol, permeates all in Nevroim, and all of them indicate on the Achdus. So despite the fact that there's so many different creations and creatures, they all indicate an Achdus. And now he's going to conclude, and just read one more line. Because all this is hinted to in the word Su'u Morim Einechem, Shema. Hine hasog mizeh hu b'su'u morim einechem. Hasog mizeh hu b'su'u morim einechem. What means hasog mizeh? Meaning,
he's explaining it the next line.
Yeah. The hasog mizeh, the understanding from this is through Sodom is when we raise our eyes upward. When a person who's standing on earth lifts himself up and draws and it means he suspends. He how do you say?
Steht hecher, atefach. He's taking.
I'm trying to find the English word. It's like somebody
exclude.
Not exclude. Meitzi atzmei. 1 second. It's when somebody's, let's say, inside of a pit, and then they lift themselves up. They draw themselves out from a state. That's what it means. They transcend. There's a word in English. I'm missing the word. Meitzi atzmei. They carry themselves out. They lift themselves up. Anyway, I'll find the word. Meanwhile, so what are you doing when you say, what's Surimara Menechem? Without that posuk, you're standing on earth and you're involved and immersed in Gashmis and Chumris, in the material and the crassness of this world. When a person lifts themselves up from that and they lift their eyes upward, from the crassness of Gashmis, then he comes to see. He comes in the direction of seeing the truth, ha'emes, the mi bara ela, that look at who created all of this. Shem tzva ha'aretz. So the first half of the pasuk, Sumar melech meru mi bara ela, is talking about tzva ha'aretz. So in other words, his bonus is pull yourself out, drag yourself out, pull yourself out from the Gashmis Chumris. Then you see the divine, and he says that's Tzva Oretz, not Tzva Shamayim yet, that's Tzva Oretz. And that is the content of Shema, the Shema that you are sensing at that head, the Achdus Hashem in all of creation. Okay, good. Like we learned earlier, that you see Hakol Hu Elokus, that everything is godly, not material. That is the first part of the pasuk. Then he's going to continue the second part. He's going to talk about Tzva Hashamayim. I see. Okay. I'll just read one more line. V'hameitzi b'mispet tzvam. The next phrase in the verse, the one hameitzi b'mispet tzvam that carries hameitzi draws out b'mispet tzvam, the multitude of the tzvam who hayidiyah v'asaga b'tzva shamayim. That's the perception and the comprehension in the celestial bodies. Okay. I'm going to stop here because now starts, going into detail. So bottom line, we've now entered into more discussions, Sumar Menechem, Shema, and is explaining that it's going to address both Tzva Oretz and Tzva Shamayim. And I hope he's going to go back to the two types of Eir in Tzva Shamayim, in Masaprim, or the Yerdanisht. And if he doesn't, we'll have to find more explanation, but we'll get there. Okay, I'm going to stop here at the bottom of page